Ginny, thank you so much for joining us today. This is really special to have the opportunity to talk to you. It's so
Oh, well,
nice.
thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank
You're
you.
quite a star both on both sides of the pond, so I'm thrilled
Oh,
to have the chance to talk to you today about your work.
well, thank you. That's very kind.
And
Thank you.
before we dive into actually looking at some examples of your work, I thought we could maybe perhaps talk to you a little bit about what inspires you. And I'm wondering first if do you have any horticultural heroes, as it were?
Well, I do. And I was thinking hard about this because it's a difficult question to answer. And actually, what it came down to were two men called Roger Phillips and Martin Ricks, who did a number of books that I think might be out of print by now. I've got
Hmm,
them. And they are both botanists and they've traveled all over the world.
interesting.
And when I became really interested in gardening, when my hobby started to take control of me, um, their books were absolutely amazing because obviously you don't get to travel to see plants in their native habitat. And so the
Right.
things that we put in our gardens is fascinating. They produced, I'm going to see if I can find one. Excuse me. Whoops. They're really unassuming little books, like paperback
Beautiful.
books like
Oh,
that.
how beautiful.
But they would take photos of plants in their natural habitat. And that somehow just gives you a whole different insight into the thing that you're wanting to use. You know, and all of our garden plants have originated from around the world,
Of course.
um, from nature, really, and then being bred up to what we use now. So they're my heroes. I think, you know, they got out there and did it. They
I
really,
love I love
yeah.
that your heroes are actual botanists and not necessarily other landscape architects or designers.
Ha, no.
You're
No.
looking to true plantsmen.
Yeah, real plantsman, because that's where you understand, you know, when you really get a good understanding of how to use the plants and where they came from, what they like, you know, what their characters are. It's like getting to know a room full of people at a
I love
party. And if you want your party to be good, the people have to get on, you know, so that's, that's the way I come to it. So they're my real heroes. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there certain either famous, well-known, or historic gardens that you do turn to for inspiration?
Yeah, there are. And it's going to make me sound very old fashioned, I'm sure, but I love no garden more than Hidcote, which
Oh,
is the big famous Lawrence Johnston Cotswold garden. And even though I think over the years of it not being his garden and becoming a public garden, it's suffered in some ways, you just can't undermine the thought that went into it and his passion for the relationship of the garden to the landscape and the way you move between all the rooms and the textures and the I used to go as a very small child with my mother and my aunt, and the planting was still probably largely by him.
oh
and
wow.
and I can remember it, and it was just I don't know, really wonderful gardens do something to you emotionally, you know, and I just loved it. I love it still. So I think gardens aren't fashion, you know, they're just good or bad, I think.
I love that. They're either good or bad.
Yeah.
It's sort of nice in life to have something that's just either good or bad.
Yeah, isn't it?
It's very
Yeah.
clear. I love it. I love it.
Thank you.
What about outside the natural world? Is there something that sparks your creativity beyond the natural world?
Yeah, art and music,
Mm,
really.
yeah,
Yeah,
music. I love that.
music. Yeah, I always wanted to be a musician. I never thought I would be a gardener. I always wanted to be a singer. My husband is a musician,
Uh-huh.
um, and so the majority of our friends are musicians. And
Oh
we were
wow.
actually, I had a friend of mine here yesterday singing backwards. You know, she
Oh,
was
I love.
singing hymns backwards. So there's something about sound and color and light. You know, so in art, I think really a lot of the thing that makes gardens so magical is the fact that you can't control what the light's doing and how the light changes and how
Yeah,
it influences color. And that sort of sonic layer and light layer are the things that make them magical, I think.
that's so interesting. I had
Yeah.
never thought about putting sound to the very visual component of gardens, but that really makes sense. What about
Yeah.
even? It almost feels like there's a rhythm too.
Yes.
The garden.
Yeah. Yeah. And you were saying when, you know, we met earlier, you were saying that you've got a big gale blowing, we've got huge
Yes.
winds blowing here, and it does that sort of kinetic activity really brings gardens to life, doesn't
To
it?
life.
Yeah,
Exactly.
literal life. Yeah.
Literal life. There's nothing static about it and nothing.
No, no.
Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
interesting.
And that's why I think photography is sometimes strange in gardening, because it doesn't give you the whole story, the whole feeling, the whole, they
I
need
can,
filming really.
yeah, I mean, it feels strange to admit this as a magazine editor, but I look at a
Oh
lot
yeah,
of,
sorry.
well, that's okay. I'm gonna agree with you. I look at a lot of garden photography and it just always leaves me a little bit wanting. It's like,
Yes.
that's not really what it was in my mind,
Yeah.
and how do
Well, they're
we,
not static. There isn't that stasis, and that's immediately put in, isn't it? And they're for moving through. So I think that again is a bit like, opera. It's a performance, isn't it? You're moving through something. You're moving through a story. Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense.
There you go.
Well, let's take a look at some of your images so we can dig in, as it were, to some of the specifics of your work. Can you
Here we
tell us
go.
what we're looking at here, which this is such an, talk about an image of a garden. This one is an intriguing one.
Well, this is my very first ever Chelsea Flower Show in
Oh,
2002, which was for the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles. And we decided to make an entire, I mean, he's quite a taskmaster. I had to incorporate the tenets of Islam.
what?
Yeah, the tenets of Islam, natural philosophy, the Fibonacci series. So complex mathematics. I'm not mathematical. Then he wanted everything to be organic. So this is a woven hedge, we call in English a laid hedge. So this is a typical way that you would do field boundaries. At the front, there's organic meadow grass that we went and dug up from Highgrove, his home in the Cotswolds. And then the whole of the garden in the next image you'll see is made with, oh yeah, there we are. There's this shelter. That's an incredibly complex arc. And the
Wow.
only way you can make the arc of the Fibonacci series in green architecture is by weaving it in willow. So we wove that in willow and then made this shelter. Everything in this garden had a medicinal, there were 150 different species and each one of them had a medicinal application or was edible. So it was unbelievably challenging because I hadn't been gardening for very long. And so he invited me to do this. And I said to, when I was asked, I said, why me? And they said, you don't have an ego. And I thought, oh, you see, you haven't got it. Have I? I probably have now. But
what a
so,
refreshing, I mean, what a refreshing compliment too.
Well, it was nice. Yeah, it was nice. He's a very, very interesting man. I really enjoyed it. There he is. This is a garden I did a bit later. This was a more celebratory garden based around gardening on chalk, which and it was sponsored by Laurent Perrier Champagne.
I love it.
Because champagne's grown on chalk soil, which is, and in France they call it the pays pourri, the rotten country, because you'll supposedly not be able to grow anything on it, and yet out of this terrible ground came beautiful champagne. And so I decided to celebrate that. Anyway, he's very enthusiastic. That's half of Camilla you can see to the right.
Oh my gosh, that's right. I can just see, just make her out. Yeah. When working with him, and frankly for the Chelsea Flower Show, how long do you have to create these incredible worlds?
Well, not very long. And with the first one, usually around a year.
Okay.
But with the first one, I got brought in very late. So I think I probably had about 7 months.
Oh my word.
So they're really challenging, And this garden, hilariously, because it's England, was supposed to be all about light, bright, warm weather, and it poured with rain for the entire show. So I had these huge, great peonies, like huge, great bowl peonies, and they were holding about a pint of water by the end. Every morning we're having to empty them out, so they didn't flop. Yeah.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
So interesting. I think.
Yeah. And this is a garden I did for Prince Harry in 2013, which was the centenary of the show, and it's a royal show, and they obviously need a new royal patron. It's currently, when I made the garden for Prince Charles, the Queen Mother was the patron, and she died during the making of the garden. So we commemorated the garden to her. Then he became patron, and now obviously they need a new patron. And I think they were sizing Harry up for it. So jury's out. Don't know who's going to get it.
Yeah, he no longer lives there, so that makes
No,
it tricky.
no, I don't think he'll be doing it from Montecito.
From
Although
California.
there are some amazing gardens around there.
There are some amazing gardens there.
There really are, aren't there? Yeah.
There, that's I'm between where you are and where they are. I would say those are my two top garden spots.
Yeah, actually, I have got a couple of favorite gardens in California, but I haven't mentioned those.
Well,
Um,
maybe we'll get to that in a minute.
we'll get back to the. But this was his charity in Lesotho in Africa, and I decided to take the forms of the landscape and make them in really high tech and the form of the dwelling that people live in, this rondavelle, and do it in a very high tech way. So this is laser cut stone, looking like the contours of the landscape, and
Absolutely.
this pavilion, which I call this, it's called the Sky Kingdom Lesotho. So I made this sky pavilion, which has a hole in the top.
I was going to ask you if it was open at the top.
It does. It has this, it's a bit like a Tyrrell at the top. So you can sit in there. And just for good measure, I did put a champagne shelf in it. So
Well, it wouldn't be the Chelsea Flower Show
without one. No, definitely not. So yeah. Oh, look, and there he is.
And
There
here
we
you
are.
are with Prince Harry.
Yeah, he was just back from Afghanistan I'd been communicating with him between here and when he was on his last tour of duty in Afghanistan. So he was getting my drawings through a fax.
Oh my goodness. I was going to say
Yeah.
that must have been so complicated because, as someone's on that type of tour, I can only imagine communication is not what it typically
It's
is.
complicated, and you don't expect to be worrying about Chelsea Flower Show, do you? But he was really engaged with it. I mean, very fully engaged. He knew exactly what was going on. We had a few meetings back here.
Did he have a lot of opinions?
Yeah, but good ones. He's very informed, and he knows his subject. He doesn't know much about plants, but he does know African native. He knows all the animals.
Yeah.
We made a soundtrack for the garden, actually. My husband and I made a soundtrack for the garden.
Wow.
And we had Lesotho eagles in it. And he was going, they're the wrong eagles. And we were saying, no, they're not. So he knows his birds. So
that is quite incredible.
Yeah, it's
that
good.
is quite incredible.
Really good. Nice guy.
Kind of on the same topic of those gardens, I wanted to ask you, because of course you've had the fabulous opportunity to do some really special gardens for some very high profile people like Prince Charles and Prince Harry. So how do you, when you're working with a person like that, how do you design a garden that can be both enjoyed every day, but then also be the kind of place where someone like that can entertain in a very formal way?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, people are quite straightforward, really. I think a lot of it is about the proportion, and how do you structure gardens, so that if you study the architecture, there's going to be the smart, the arrival, then there's going to be the sort of private side, then there's going to be the working side, and for staff or whatever, and then there's going to be the front. So the front usually looks over the landscape, and that can have a marquee zone in it, but you could have that there or not there. I sort of try and make it so you could use all aspects of the garden at all times without feeling peculiar about it, but that the proportions are there if you want to suddenly go large and have a great big party, or most people want to have a huge party at some point. But then it's nice to create the environment. I did one garden which had this huge topiary lawn in it, and there was a space behind it for a marquee that you would never have noticed. And then the party could have taken place all the way through the topiary, and we could have lit it. We did light it all up and make it look all really exciting. So I don't know. And most people of wealth don't necessarily want wealth forced on them. They don't. They don't necessarily want very ostentatious things. Quite often they'd like much gentler environments to be in.
Perhaps especially at their home.
Yeah.
Where they
may. I think even though I do these very, high end, I think it's called, or big, terrible phrase, isn't it? I try and make them human, because really we're all subject to the same emotions and aren't we? And
it's so true. Whenever I'm nervous to interview someone new or present to someone new, my husband will always say, well, he's just a person, or she's just a person. And it's like, oh, that's right.
And I used to work in mental health, and essentially, we all bleed red. We're all exactly the same, and we can be leveled very easily by
That's
our you know innate humanity. So
that's
and I
so
find people like beautiful things. They just want to be happy in their homes and gardens, really.
and surrounded by beauty and able to immerse themselves in
Yeah,
beauty.
yeah, yeah,
I love that.
yeah.
Speaking of beauty, let's take a look at another
Uh,
garden that you've designed. That I have a whole new topic to discuss with you about this. But tell us
aha.
where we are in the world, even with this
In the
garden.
world, well, this is in the Rift Valley in Kenya, in Laikipia in Kenya, and so we built a lodge on a conservation an estate that is a very large estate, high up. It's 6,000 feet above sea level. So
Oh
you get
wow!
altitude. I got slight altitude. I got mild altitude sickness.
I
You
can
suddenly can't lift your case yourself. I
imagine.
felt,
Right.
you go, wow, that suddenly got really heavy. And very high up, facing Mount Kenya,
Wow.
absolutely stunning in this huge environment.
Oh,
And they are the people who own it. There you
amazing.
go. I mean, literally nothing. I think the nearest the nearest town is about 2 hours away down dirt
Wow.
tracks, and Nairobi is about 6 hours away down, and there are no roads here. Let's face it, there are dirt tracks. And you come into land on a strip of mud the first time we came in, we had to go around 3 times because there were giraffe on the landing strip, and we
On
had
the
to sort of
strip
shoo them off with the with
with
our
the
Cessna. You're kind of
I
coming down,
love it.
yeah, go on.
Flybys to shoo them away.
Yeah, exactly. And we wanted to make something. It's a conservation area estate, and the people who own it have let out these parcels of land to people to build, I think, just 4 lodges on the whole place. So this was one of
Amazing.
them. It's open, so you can go and stay there, and
Wow.
it is really worth it. It
I
is
really want.
really worth it. It's called Arijiju. It's on Burana in Laikipia in Kenya, and it is really worth going. Wonderful place, and they're saving the black rhino basically, and many other things. And they've got this initiative where they're now joining other huge estates up. So Lewa Downs, which is where Prince William and Kate got engaged, is next door, and they're making these huge migration corridors. So that is the setting.
Wonderful.
And then this is the house. So I was initially asked if I would come out and create this courtyard. The architect's an old friend of mine, and we worked on it together. He and I both have strong links to France, and
Mm.
it's the Rift Valley. There's no architectural precedent,
Ama-
really. So
Wow.
nothing, nobody builds there. So,
Yeah.
the houses are thatched round huts, basically.
With
So we took this,
mud walls.
we took a kind of, because you have to live defensively because the animals have greater precedence than we do.
Mm. What a lovely
So,
notion.
yeah. So we made a kind of medieval courtyard, if you like. So kind of a bit Southern European, I guess.
You do, I mean, yeah, between the courtyard and even the arches, you do have that, you do get that sort of Southern European
Mm.
feel. I
And
love that.
again, in this courtyard, I really wanted to be immersed in the planting. So you can see there are just stepping stones to these oases of a terrace in the middle. And there are 2 terraces. And then the first image that we saw was this pool of water. And there we
Oh,
go. And
just
that was to create a kind of moat. It's that kind of slightly Moorish thing.
mhm.
And
I
we did
love
have a problem. I mean, you learn a lot doing these things, and everyone's going, oh, the frogs will drive you mad. And I say, no, they won't. And then they all move in and they make such a racket, that
that.
we've literally got a frog man who has to take them out, take them back down to the river, and then they
Back to
just
the river.
march back uphill. Yeah.
That is
So,
fascinating. That's
yeah.
really,
So if we move on, we can have a look at a couple of
yeah,
other.
let's see the next, if we go there.
So
Oh,
yes, so this is where the pool is. I don't even think I've given you an image of the pool like a fool, but this is the black olive tree that was there to start with, and we decided to build the entire project around it. So
fabulous.
that's a very, very old tree. If you could see what trees have to go through in that landscape, they're always getting chewed by giraffe and elephants. And this is my elephant terrace, elephant ha-ha. So you can sit on the terrace and the elephants can't get up. They can sort of tap their trunks on it.
And are they trying to get to the trunk, to the tree, or are they just trying to say hello? Or
No, they're
maybe
just
they love
saying hi. Actually, just slightly to the left of this picture, I don't think I put it in. We've got a swimming pool. And they
Lovely.
largely come for water. I mean, water
Right.
is so magnetic in that landscape.
They're looking
That's
for
what they're
water.
coming for. Yeah.
It's amazing to me how the shape of that wall just kind of follows the contours of the tree. It's really beautiful.
There's no mistake in that steel.
No,
Yeah.
precision.
Bit of yeah, that was a bit of measuring.
So,
So,
having been in London really, and then now we've been in Africa. Are there any other places in the world where you would love to work someday? Perhaps a dream
oh,
locale.
well, I have to say, I do love the States. It's so interesting. It's so diverse. I've worked in Maine and I've worked in New York and I've done a bit of work on the West Coast. And we've got a job in Georgia at the
Oh,
moment.
exciting.
Yeah. And it's just so interesting, you know. I mean, the variety and the sheer enormity of
Yes.
the United States of America and the difference, you know, from place to place. Yeah.
There's
So
quite a bit of variety even in the climate.
yeah, the climate's nuts. I don't know how you live in it.
It is bizarre. It is bizarre.
Really, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, the first time I went to Maine, it was in an ice storm, and the guys on site were all wearing kind of string vests and Carhartt shorts, and it was minus a number. You know, I can't even tell you what number it was. It was very minus.
Very minus.
Very minus, yeah. And they just had an oil drum with some, which they were throwing bits of timber into,
Oh
and
my.
they,
I've
they
seen that.
couldn't they couldn't feel it.
Oh
I
my
was like,
gosh.
yeah.
Wow.
So that was interesting. I just love that kind of having to get under the skin of a place and its climate and what it does, and you know,
Yeah.
really. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
Well, we'll have to get you stateside again soon, and keep me posted on projects in Georgia and California. That sounds
I
interesting.
will. I will. Yeah, yeah.
Georgia is my home state, so I'm
Oh, is
particularly.
it?
Yes.
Is it? Huh.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, roll on the end of COVID.
oh, that's right. Yes, indeed.
You know, and then we can actually start doing these things that we like so much again.
We can get you back over here.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back to England for a minute and look at one more project of yours. And this time we're in the Cotswolds. And I'm going to ask you to talk to us a little bit about sort of balancing structure and order versus a sense of wild.
Yeah, this garden is a big garden. The house is incredibly old. There's been a house on the site since the Doomsday Book, which was 10, when was it? I have no
Oh
idea.
gosh,
10 something.
1,000 years ago. Yes.
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah. And then the house that there's now I don't know if you have a listing system. We have a system of listing houses, and this is grade 1. So it's a historic monument.
Wow.
A very beautiful old house, and quite small because, you know, size in those days was relative. And I've built a garden of 18 rooms here. So this is an old drover's track, a sheep drover's track,
Wow.
essentially. This is a little part, this is like a little street between two parts of the garden.
Amazing.
That my client very obligingly, we just kept buying other buildings in the village and piecing the whole place back together. So essentially we've got a little medieval village.
Wonderful.
And so this particular view goes from relatively formal with the topiary, and then the further down you get, the wilder it gets, and then it sort of spits you out into the countryside proper, where that big tree is at the end. And if we have another look at
Let's see if we go to the next.
Shall we move on? Yeah.
There we go.
And then
Yes.
so these buildings at the end, the house is the other side, and these two buildings at the end of the pool are dovecots, and they're almost bigger than the house, because
Wow.
back then, food was more important than anything, you know.
And space, interior
Yeah,
space.
20 of you could easily sleep on one floor. So, you know, but where are you going to get your food from? So that was full of pigeons that they ate, or doves. And then my client just wanted this, his only stipulation was he wanted 100-foot long lily pond.
Wow.
So it's on top of a hill and everything's all over the place. But anyway, I achieved it for him. And then
Well,
what
and
else?
here, I mean, even compared to the previous image, here this is very symmetrical and it's very sort of geometric.
Yeah. Well, it's
Um,
important to move between spaces. So, you know,
yeah.
this is the very large, this would have been originally the vegetable garden, but it's over
Wow.
an acre. And you can't, you know, who in their right mind needs an acre of vegetables? We
Oh
don't need,
gosh,
you know,
you couldn't eat that many.
we have farmers markets now. So,
Right.
so it's become the formal garden, if you like, and I terraced it, and it's quite smart. This is quite a severe photo, actually. It doesn't look quite as bad as that in real life.
No, it's
And then
beautiful. It's beautiful.
and we could have a look on at
The next one.
yeah.
Ah,
And then this is the end of that first walk, where
okay.
there's a little gate, and by that big pink rose it kind of leads you out into the countryside. So the
Nice.
planting sort of, it's quite a formal garden because it's
Mm.
got all these compartments and rooms, but I still like the planting to be relaxed, really. I think
I love that. I love that.
yeah.
There's it feels painterly almost. There's sort of
Oh, thank you.
brushstrokes of different plantings that that I'm
Yeah.
sure required a great deal of intentionality, and yet they just look like they've always been here.
I think again it's proportion. If you know, the rose at the end is Rosa californica plana, which is a huge wild Californian wild rose, and it's a big old thing. And you just, for it to look lovely, you just have to allow it enough space. So you have to hold your breath in the first year or so, and think it needs, you know, 10 foot by 10 foot to really look great. But
Mm.
then it does this, you know, whereas if it were in too small a place and you were having to chop it about, it will never achieve that flavor, if you like. And the apple trees we keep very tightly pruned, and then that gives you the sense that you're in a husbanded,
Mm.
looked after, cared for landscape, even though it's a fruit tree.
I don't
Mm.
think I would have I wouldn't have appreciated the fact that you keep the apple trees kind of pruned back, but that makes such a difference here. That gives it the sort of order among
Order.
all the,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Well, I've got this theory that you can't really enjoy disorder unless you can appreciate that there's order underneath it,
Oh, I love
because
that.
you know, otherwise it's just chaos,
Right.
and a mess. And we're, as humans, we're kind of hardwired to be scared of the wild, really, you know,
Yes. And
aren't
yet
we?
at
I
the
mean, the
same time,
wild is dangerous, you know.
the wild is dangerous. And yet I've also been doing so much reading really over the past year about how, as humans, we also need um, access to wild, and we need
Yes.
to experience wild.
Yeah.
And I'm a mother, and I need to make sure my children get access to the wilderness and
Yes, it's
and
really
to the
important. Well, you have access to the wilderness. You know,
wild.
I flew from I flew from Charleston
Mm,
to the West Coast, and I was looking out of the window literally for the whole flight, which is, as you know, quite long.
quite long, 4 or 5
Quite
hours.
long, yeah. And there were vast areas with no people,
It's
really, that I could see, and little wildfires going off, you know, and just, and for somebody from Europe and certainly from the British Isles, there are very few places where you can go where you can't see the hand of man. You know, there are very few left, really.
it's that is, I mean, you're right, and that is one of the great. I hope we don't blow it here in the States, but at least in
Yeah,
the southeastern United States, we have trees, and it's
yeah,
just
you do. Yeah,
not to
yeah,
be taken for granted.
yeah. So yeah.
So, well, I think that leads us to it's a perfect sort of dovetail to my final question for you, which is um, try to figure out how to phrase it to end on a high note. But when we're thinking about the future of landscape design, are there concerns that you have, and do you have answers?
Wow, that's a big one. How are
I
you?
know, just a big one
Just
to
a,
think about.
I think we just have to really, you know, listen to the pandemic,
Mm,
see what it's done to us,
yes,
and not forget it. You know, it's made us all appreciate the small things. You
yes,
know, we don't have to live at 36,000 feet. We don't have to consume enormous quantities of stuff, you know,
so true.
and everything. We don't have to have these highly energized lives, and we're happier. And I think our productivity is just as good,
I do
speaking
too.
for myself and for those who I speak to. And I think that we have to try and hang on to that and put that. It's always been in my work, you know, and when I was a psychologist and now as a landscaper. So I'm sort of happy with what the pandemic has forced us,
Mm.
and we've been very lucky. I mean, lots of people are not lucky. You
Of
know, I
course.
look at India and they're not lucky with this, or
Mhm.
Brazil, it's horrific. And so, you know, there, but for the grace of God go we. And if we don't remember that that's how fragile this is, you know, I think, and it's down to each of us, isn't it,
You're
to do
exactly
it?
right.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
down to
it.
each of us. And
You
you're right
know,
that those of us who have been lucky, we have a responsibility to
yeah,
take that
yeah,
forward.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think
Well,
it's that really. Just stay small and be glad.
yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Well, and think I wouldn't have probably had the chance to meet you and be able to do
No,
this were we
no,
not were
brilliant.
forced to stay home and,
Yeah, yeah,
not live at 36,000 feet.
yeah.
And
It's so
like,
much better.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
much
love
more relaxed. Yeah. Well,
it.
yeah, phew.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Well,
well, thank
Jenny,
you.
thank you so much for your time today and your creativity and your beauty and your wisdom. And
Oh, thank
appreciate
you.
it for sharing.
Thank you for having me. And
Of course,
thank you
for
all for coming
pleasure.
and listening. Okay.
Thank you for tuning in, everyone.
Okay. Bye
Bye.
now. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.